Hello, everybody, and welcome to the October 26th, 2021 iteration of the Kubernetes SIG-Windows community meeting. As always, these meetings are recorded, so please be sure to adhere to the CNCF Code of Conduct. Let's jump in. First of all, announcements. Code freeze is about 3 weeks away. I believe that's November 18th for 123. So yeah, let's just keep working on getting all of the work that we want in. I've seen a lot more action, both reviews and submissions of PRs, which is good. It always helps to get those in early. If anybody has any concerns about functionality not making it in and or about not getting enough PR traction, please reach out in Slack and we'll try and address that as soon as possible. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to announce? If not, we can jump in.
I'd add we merged host process container support and containerd and cluster API for Azure last week. So if you've been holding off on trying to try out the host process stuff, it's a little bit easier now with cluster API for Azure. So give it a check out. I'll get a link and drop it in there.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so we've got the same tests that we have running for AKS engine and Windows without both on Docker and containerd there. So we have a pretty good idea of how stable everything is and looks really good so far. Thanks, James. Yeah, we'll get a link as a reference for people who want to experiment and build on top of that. That was a pretty big PR too, so thank you. Okay, let's go into this first item, which spilled over from last week. Arvind and Brendan, I saw Brendan on a call. If we want to have him here for this too.
Yep.
But yeah, anything you want to say about this, Arvind? We can't hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. So yeah, following up from last week regarding the projected volume documentation, I think we did go back and forth a little bit on Slack on this. The key bit is I think I will open a PR, a doc PR to document this. And I think it should go in the projected volume section in the docs is what I'm guessing, and maybe we should link to that from somewhere in the Windows side where we talk about the storage options available. So that's my plan. But the key bit that I think we wanted to discuss this time around is in OpenShift, we have a workaround for if a user decides to use both run as user and run as username, the pod will not come up. And in OpenShift, we have an admission controller for pods that actually add both of them, which causes Windows pods to just not come up, right? So there potentially could be other clusters that have this issue, which is why we wanted to just discuss, do we just document, hey, folks, don't do this, or do we try and upstream that workaround that we have in OpenShift? So that's the main thing we need to discuss.
So I have a question around that. So assuming that all of the work to add the OS field to the pod spec lands and goes alpha in 123 and hopefully beta in 124, would it be, do you envision that the admission controller that you have in OpenShift would not would use that information to not add the run as user bits on there? So it would only have the run as username bits?
Yeah.
Or would you still have the behavior of adding both?
No, I don't think we would do that. Once we can clearly identify whether a pod is a Windows pod versus a Linux pod, I don't think we'll keep doing that. The main issue now is there is no, how do you put it? There's no clear way to identify, right?
There's no single authoritative definitive way. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, somebody could try and fake it and then come up with like weird security issues, and that's why we were like, okay, we cannot guess whether the pod is for Windows. But yeah, the minute the OS field goes in, and I'm assuming, and at that point we'll change that admission control.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that if we try and upstream any changes with that question is going to be asked. And then the next question is going to be, how hard is it going to be to remove it, like remove the check upstream once once the once the OS field is there. And my feeling is, in general, folks, especially like Jordan Liggett, prefer to not put in things that they know are going to be removed or obsolete right away. So I think this might be good. Like, this is clearly like founded in OpenShift and OpenShift specific, but is anybody on the call, are they familiar with, like, are they running into this issue? Is there more use cases that, or like scenarios that are getting impacted by this that would maybe present a stronger case for upstreaming a fix temporarily for this?
Even if you make change in OpenShift, what if someone manually provides those names during the pod admission time? How should we handle that scenario? Shouldn't we have a stronger validation at the API stage? Like, say if someone provides run as username and run as user. Say in OpenShift, we have removed that check based on the pod field, the OS field that is going to get introduced. What if someone manually provides both? So
today, if somebody manually provides both, it'll fail, correct? Or the container won't start. Is that?
Yeah, the container won't start. And to answer Ravi's question, so Ravi, I think the statement we're trying to make in that doc is don't do it. If you want to shoot yourself in the foot, go for it. I think that's what we are thinking about saying in the doc.
Yeah, to be clear, why can't we enforce that in the API validation? Would that cause any impact?
So I think we can do that only after your PR goes in, where you are clearly identifying whether this pod is OS or not. Today, if we try to do this, they're again going to push back saying, how do you know this is a OS? How do you know this is a Windows pod or not? So yes, Ravi, once your pod spec change goes through, yeah, sure, we can add API validation.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. Like, once it goes in, once we are authoritatively able to identify the Windows pods, can we have that validation?
Yeah.
Or is that going to cause any backwards compatibility issues?
It shouldn't, right? Because the end result is the same, right? Your API validation, I'm assuming, is going to reject the pod.
Yeah, instead of container runtime or
Correct.
once it lands on it. So.
Now today, the behavior is kind of bad, right? It just doesn't go to running. And folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of things at play. One is, so here's the actual logic that happens on the kubelet for this. Is it all? Here's some of it. I know that there's one space where there's a run as user check, and if run as user is set, the pod doesn't go to running. This might not be the only one. So yeah, there's a couple of kind of discrepant behaviors. One is that these checks happen at the kubelet, and once we can identify them, yes, I think that they should happen at admission time. I think it's much clearer for users to figure out what happened if that is the case. If that happens at API admission time, you can get better errors and everything. Today, I think, I mean, it might be possible to have that API admission check without the OS field and just check to see if both of those are set and error out and say, we can't make a determination, but we know this is invalid. But it could lead back to the same like arguments and saying, you know, this OS field is coming, just wait, and then you can have better checks. So.
Yeah, so like either in the documentation, if we can clearly call out that this will be rejected in future releases, I think that would be.
So Ravi, in documentation, the minute you use the word future, they're going to reject that PR. They don't like to mention anything that is conjecture. Yeah, sure. I mean, we know that it'll happen, right? But in docs, you can't mention what's going to happen in the future. You have to state what the current state is.
I see. Okay.
So
Yeah.
I think the way forward is to document the way it is today. And as part of the PR or where you're adding the check to reject this, you fix the documentation.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't even think, I was wondering if we could point to the KEP in the docs and say, this is going to address it, and not have any future looking statements, and just say like, this is the plan to address it. We already have a KEP that's been approved for alpha. I don't know if that will be approved or not, or if they wanted to just limit it to current behavior like you mentioned. Yeah, so I'm on the fence if like I don't know if we want to try and change the behavior upstream today or not. Potentially we could start a thread in, and I think Jordan Liggett, who's is probably the person that we should talk to in Slack. I wonder if we should add him to the thread in Slack and SIG-Windows and see if what he thinks here.
I think changing the behavior now and then rejecting it in the future is not the best route to go. I think document it, leave the behavior as is, and then reject it in the future. And I don't see any backwards compatibility with rejecting it earlier in the cycle. It's just a better user experience and overall.
Yeah, that makes total sense, James, because I mean, I would say change in behavior is if the end result was something different, right? Here, the end result is still the same. It's just, like you said, better user experience.
When we document it, it might be helpful to have the exact error message that the kubelet spits out too. So if people search for that, hopefully they can hit it. Say like, I think we should be clear and say like, if you see this error, these are the things to check, and have that error string, and then just say make sure that you're not setting both of these. These fields are essentially mutually exclusive. At least the kubelet treats them like that.
I think you can only find, from what I remember when I was doing this, I think you can only find it in the logs. I don't think it shows up in the pod itself.
These ones, where was it? I think that there's a couple different ways that you can trigger that. If you have the security, if you have run as non-root set, it will fail here. And this shows up in as an event, and kubectl describe pod will show this. We should make sure that there is where we should see if there's what happens when run as non-root is not set to true.
That's the way I've been testing it.
Yeah. So is that,
if I look at the,
we can take that offline.
Yeah.
To move the agenda forward. But yeah, let's see if we can figure out all of the different failure scenarios and possibly update in the kubelet code too to have to emit an event or something that would show up in that case instead of just getting stuck. That might be a good.
So one thing I'll note on the documentation front, from the MSDN side, we do have a little bit of documentation on the different user types and the containers, and we do call out the permissions in mounting volumes that could arise. Sorry, the issues that could arise from using something like Container Administrator with the mounted volume and being able to add public keys and such. I'll link that here, but in terms of extended documentation, I think my plan is to document more clearly the capabilities of the user accounts in containers and call out this issue specifically. If you're mounting volumes in with Windows containers, you run these potential risks. But if there's anything else you think we should add, I'm open to it.
No, well, I think that's good for now. And also, I think Brandon and a couple of the folks internally at Microsoft were talking, and we were kind of thinking it might be a good idea to use a portion of potentially one of the upcoming KubeCon talks to really deep dive into the differences of the container user versus container administrator. If anybody else would like to see that or have some specific questions for that, please feel free to reach out. We're curious if like what we can do to make that more transparent to everybody. Okay, there's a link to that doc. For folks who are interested. Okay, is there anything else to discuss on this topic during the meeting here? Or should we move on? Okay, next, I see Lubomir, run as user group should have been strings in the pod API to support the students ahead of time. Yeah, I think that yeah, I think if there's ever a pod v2 spec, I think we all know a lot more about all the nuances of the different security descriptors for Windows and the shortcomings of just having a string and everything. So yeah, I agree with that comment. Next agenda item, there's a PR review request. I've actually been following this PR with a couple of other folks. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, this is Hefferney in GitHub. Basically, this PR basically fixed the issue where external traffic policy local kind of broken in Google Cloud. It's actually not just a Google Cloud. Any pass-through load balancer with a pass-through health check should have the same issue. So the PR basically essentially in the beginning, it silently fixed the issue with some hard-coded endpoint name in it, which basically fixed Google specifically, and got some review comments basically saying that yeah, we should be able to make it more generic, but in terms of to do that, we need to expose two like flags. So the new one has 2 additional flags saying whether or not we do this forwarding, and what is the endpoint name to forward the traffic health check to. So yeah, this is the new one. Originally, I added this in the agenda because it's not to get enough attention, but right now I see like a lot of people already jump on that, so really appreciate that. Yeah, just a brief updates on like what this PR is about.
Yeah, well, before all of these updates, I was going to comment that I unfortunately like this PR needs some reviewers from a lot of different areas, and we've been trying to get the attention of some of those reviewers. Jay, are you here? This is something that you might be able to help with too, since it's a lot more of the networking folks who you meet with regularly. So I don't know if
yeah, I mean, I'm happy to review this for sure. Yeah, me and Amin are very close to doing a bunch of stuff with the Windows kube proxy, but I mean, I'm even happy to look at this during after hours right now if you want.
Yeah, that might be good. Yeah, it was sitting waiting for some kube proxy reviewers and the Win kernel proxy reviewers for a while. So, and I think we would like
let's test. Yeah, I mean, we could test it today. I mean, we could fire up a cluster right out as soon as the meeting's over and just start playing with it.
Okay, yeah. So what usually happens after we have the regular community meeting is I usually go over to SIG-Node, but that people usually pick some topics that they want to pair on, and Jay usually leads that, and then we just go through, and it can be code reviews, it could be working on a feature, or it could be just answering questions. So that might be good if you have some time to stay for a few minutes afterwards.
Yeah, of course, sure.
Yeah, cool. This will be
Cool.
exciting. Good. We've been looking for something fun to do during after hours, and we're running out of ideas. So now we got something to do. Cool.
Yeah, hopefully I get more of this to you.
Yeah, just stick around. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Next agenda item is kind of maybe a little bit related to the first one, but there's some conversations in Slack about specifically how to handle this run as non-root field for the new in API validation for the new OS field. I think we're kind of reaching consensus with Jordan here, who had some concerns, but we can continue the discussion. Ravi, do you want to lay some background, or some context, or I can?
Yeah, so just to make sure that everyone understands, the run as non-root is a field that exists in pod security context as well as container security context. What we are trying to do here is we are trying to separate Linux specific fields from non-Linux specific fields, or in this case, Windows specific fields, to ensure that the validation at the API ignition time can happen smoothly. But for this particular field, there is some confusion, like should we have it or should we not have it? Because in case of Windows, we have this run as user where the root user is equivalent to container administrator. And we are actually validating based on the container administrator username, not on UID, just like in case of Linux, where we have UID equal to 0, which maps to root user. And we also have this UID to make sure that it is not root. We do not have that in case of Windows. So that's where the confusion is. So I was initially thinking that we will make this Linux specific, this run as non-root, and we can use run as username to make sure that the validation for the administrator happens. But I think Mark suggested that people may be using non-root user, like run as non-root field, and then map it with container user, container administrator. So thought, okay, just to preserve the backwards compatibility, it is okay. But I think at some point of time, we need to get rid of this.
Yeah, and I think to add to some confusion, on the Windows page, it's documented that this run as non-root does not do anything for Windows, but in fact it does. So the behavior, and a lot of that behavior is here. And outside of this call, so the behavior today is that when the kubelet tries to start a container on Windows, if this run as non-root is set, and what run as non-root is supposed to be to prevent anybody from running containers as root. On Windows, what that has that wrong file. On Windows, what has been determined, and there's some conversations here, was that any container running as the container administrator is treated as root. So if you set run as non-root to true, it will check to make sure that run as username is not set to container administrator, and then also make sure that the default, if run as username is not set, it checks to make sure that the default user in the container image is also not container administrator. And if it is, it errors out and fails to start the container in the kubelet. So my concerns are that people may be using this as, maybe using this either kind of knowing that it works for Windows, or just unintentionally, they stumbled on it when they were trying to play with it for Linux, and maybe relying on that functionality, especially like other policy and admission engines. So
what's fundamentally wrong about that logic? So
nothing's fundamentally wrong about that logic, but I don't think anything's fundamentally wrong about that logic. One of the big discrepancies now is that it's not documented So that is an action item and one of the actions on the one of the feedback on the PR that's linked in that conversation. But the other, yeah. So I think yeah, that's a good question. I didn't see anything fundamentally wrong about that logic, except for it's not documented, and two, I think that there is a lot of room for improvement for Microsoft to really highlight like the differences between container administrator and other users and what that allows. In the document that Brendan linked, it starts to talk about that, and it does say that if you are if you run the container as container administrator and then allow like host path mounts, you are accessing, like the container is accessing any of the volumes there as if it was in the administrators group for like on the machine. So that is something that we should, document, make sure we're aware of. And given that, like, I think that that's similar to root access from a container. So I think right now, my feeling is that this behavior we should keep and just document it. How do other people?
Like, I guess it's just a matter of documenting that there is no such thing as root. So the closest thing to it is this.
Yeah.
And that's, yeah, fine. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think my concern is more on the lines of tying the field called run as non-root user to a container administrator, where, like, say if there is no association between those two fields, then I think I would have been okay with it, because there is nothing like a root user in case of Windows. What we are trying to tell to the user effectively who is submitting a pod spec is, and to me, a lot of it is sort of a baggage that we have been carrying around, because when the API was introduced, Windows was not in the mix, like run as non-root and all that kind of stuff. So like in the Windows options of the security context, if we have something like run as username, and if you are able to tie it to a container administrator user, that should be good enough, instead of having another field in a layer above, which does not know anything about the user that is going to come in. That is where the logic threw me a bit off. That's where I was like really confused when I started working on this.
Yeah, and I think that was some of the comments in that thread that Jordan had as well. It's like on Linux, we can check to see if your user ID is greater than 0 and do this. But for Windows, it's a lot more complicated, and so there's the two built-in user accounts for containers. There's container administrator and container user. Container administrator is the much more privileged account, and then there's container user. But there's also the ability to create other users in the container and then run as that. And there's also GMSA and being able to run as domain accounts. So I think it makes it a lot harder, or it makes it a lot messier to tie things like the run as non-root to some container, like to not tie container administrator to the run as non-root.
Yeah, so I think if we just have run as user or username mapping to container administrator, that would have been good enough for us. If I understood correctly, like we can achieve the same effect with the API provided, is what I'm thinking.
Well, my concerns there is that the check that happens in the kubelet checks two sources of information. It checks the pod spec that's coming in, and if nothing's specified on the pod spec, then it goes and queries the manifest for the container image and looks to make sure that the container image doesn't have a default user of container administrator. I think that that's an important check, because if somebody publishes a container that does some things and runs a workload as container user and doesn't have the pod spec, and doesn't set, and nobody sets the run as username in the pod spec, then they could be then they'd be run, then they could run it, then we could bypass checks in the API admission time, which wouldn't check that container layer. So my thoughts were that we either needed to make sure that run as username was set and then make sure it wasn't set to container administrator, or check that, or like, and that's what we would need to do if we didn't want any of the behavior for run as non-root to impact this. And my concerns with that was that that could cause a lot of churn in the pod specs, because now, because we'd be enforcing that you need to make sure that run as username was set to make sure that the default container or the default user in the container image isn't set to container administrator. Just a lot of potentially redundant information and things. Does that make sense?
So Mark, are we missing this added complication? Can't a user create a container image, have a user create a user within that container image that's called foo, but has all administrator privileges?
No, that's not possible.
You cannot do that?
You should.
You would have administrative processes in the container, but when you would try and access host resources like through a host path volume mount, you would not access it as if you were part of the administrators group on the node.
I see. So there's no way for me to create a user called foo and then add that user to the administrator group.
Not on the host. So you could, or not be able to access host resources. So what you could do is you could make a container, add a user foo, add it to the administrators group in the container, and then that user foo would be able to do things like toggle services on the inside of the container and other manipulate files inside of the container. But when you try and do things outside of the container, you wouldn't assume the same context that you would get if you were just running as container administrator.
I see. So container administrator somehow is special.
Yes.
I see.
Container administrator has a bunch of extra privileges in comparison to the container user account. And I think in order
in the container or container local users.
Yeah, I think the thing that confused me is, so is container administrator present in the SAM of the host or of the container?
I see James laughing, Brendan.
Yeah, it's a bit of a complicated topic. It's like in general, I'd say no. Yeah, this is a. I think it's worth a further longer discussion on that.
Okay, all right. Sorry for asking the wrong question.
Yeah, but I think in general, in order to create something that's privileged in general and within the container, you're probably already using the container administrator account anyways. There's not a lot you can do with container user. It's a very restricted account. So in most cases, in the scenarios we're worried about, you need a container administrator to do that anyways.
I see. Yeah, so as long as we cannot create another user that is similar to container administrator, I think we might be okay, is what I'm seeing. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think we need a lot of documentation around this.
Yes, totally agree.
Yeah. But yes, that is a good concern, a valid concern.
I think the question is more on the lines of, should we have that field, or how long should we support run as non-root use? I'm sorry, I'm trying to bring that to.
Yeah, and my thoughts is if we don't support run as non-root, then we would need to explicitly have run as username set for all pods that would potentially want to enforce the user for policy. And I think that is, even though it doesn't kind of map to the actual implementation of how run as non-root was set up, it does map to the spirit behind that. And I think it's easier for my feeling is it's easier for people who want to enforce policy to check if a bool field is set than it is to, and less burdensome for the workloads than it is to make sure that a field that's optional today is set on all workloads and make sure it's not set to a specific value. That's my concerns. More than happy to kind of talk about it with other people, but
I think in general from the Microsoft side, what if possible, where we can make the behavior between Linux and Windows consistent, I think is what we would prefer. And I think with the run as non-root field, it is, I think, nice to have as a blanket policy in ensuring that containers only run with no low privileged accounts, especially thinking in the future, if we decide that we want to introduce more low privileged accounts for Windows containers, or limit the capabilities of container administrator. So I think it's a useful field to have.
Robbie, the main concern here is just the concept of root doesn't directly apply to Windows. Is that what you're?
Yeah, but container administrator is still a high privilege account. There's things you can do with it that could interfere with the host, and I think having the run as non-root field used as a way to enforce non-usage of that, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I think there is also this argument of using run as non-root field's side effect as a way to tell that the container administrator is the root user. So I am not comfortable with using that field as a side effect to ensure that the container user is or the container administrator is the root user. So I'm fine with it. I just want to understand the rationale behind continuing it for a long time.
So is this a question of semantics? Is this the word root that is causing the problem?
It's also about the usage of field, where people are using that field, whereas we can get the same we can get the same intent from using run as user equal to container administrator.
But yeah, I'm not sure that we can get we can't get the same intent at API admission time, and that's my big hiccup. Is unless we make sure that run as username is set on every pod spec, we can't know that the default user in the container is not container administrator at API admission time. Because we don't, at least today, we don't actually inspect the container manifest. So I think if we knew that if run as username was not set, that the container would not start as container administrator, I could see that being a case. But today, like many containers on Windows, sets run at have the default user as container administrator.
Yeah, and are you saying that will continue forever, or can we have in future enforce this particular field in the pod spec and make sure that we do not need to use run as non-root user?
I think that without making a very strong case, we would not be able to tighten validation on this and say that an optional field is now required. That you generally, at least from especially API validation, in order to preserve backwards compatibility, they allow for loosening validation. So things that were previously restricted would now be allowed, but tightening validation is very frowned upon.
Yeah, as far as I know, it takes 2 releases. That's the cadence that I know.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't know how other people feel, but would people want to specify run as username on every container and every pod spec? That seems a little bit cumbersome.
Yeah, I just want to get opinion. If that's the case that everyone wants to go with, I'm fine with it, but I just want to know the rationale.
No,
Yeah.
I think that's reasonable. And in the future, we do want to move away from the need to use container administrator by default in some images. So it'd be helpful for, I think, just to be able to set a blanket policy of don't use container administrator in the future.
I see. Okay.
All right, I need to drop to SIG-Node. So I'm going to stop the recording and hand it over to Jay now. We could continue conversations. We can also link to a Slack chat if people want to continue some conversations here. But I think it's a good discussion. I think that really highlights that we need to document like what container administrator is and what differences it has for all of that. So thank you everybody for joining. I think there's some good discussions here. Hope to see most of you or all of you next week. Bye.
Okay.